The desperate skies of 1943. 6 enemy fighters disintegrated in 14 seconds, and the pilot who destroyed them was supposed to be dead. March 1943. The skies over Nazi-occupied Europe had become a graveyard for American bomber crews. Every mission deeper into German territory meant facing the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, flying the deadly Messerschmitt Bf 19. These sleek, deadly machines had been perfected through years of combat, and their pilots knew every advantage, every weakness of the lumbering American B-17 flying fortresses that crossed into their airspace. The statistics were brutal and getting worse. Bomber Command was losing aircraft at an unsustainable rate. Some missions saw 20% losses. 20%. That meant 1 in 5 crews never came home. The young men flying those missions knew the mathematics of their own mortality. After 25 missions, statistically, you were already dead. You just hadn't caught up with the numbers yet. Captain James Jimmy Howard of the 354th Fighter Squadron understood these numbers better than most. At 30 years old, he was ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of his fellow pilots were barely old enough to drink legally. But Howard had something they didn't: experience. He'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China, racking up kills against Japanese fighters, before most of these kids had finished high school. Now he was flying P-51 Mustangs, escorting bombers deep into Germany. The P-51 was a revolution. Unlike the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that had escorted bombers before, the Mustang had the range to go all the way to Berlin and back. It was fast, maneuverable, and deadly. But even the best aircraft meant nothing if tactics couldn't evolve fast enough to match the desperate situation unfolding in European skies. January 11, 1944. The date that would change everything started like any other mission briefing. Howard and his squadron gathered in the cold pre-dawn darkness at their base in England. The target: German industrial facilities deep in enemy territory. The mission profile: escort duty for a formation of B-17s pushing into heavily defended airspace. The briefing officer's voice was matter-of-fact, but everyone in that room could read between the lines. This was going to be rough. Intelligence reported heavy Luftwaffe fighter concentrations along the route. The Bf 109 pilots would be waiting, and they'd be hungry. Howard checked his equipment with the methodical precision of a man who'd done this hundreds of times. Parachute, Mae West life vest, sidearm, maps. The ritual was comforting in its familiarity. Around him, younger pilots joked nervously, their laughter a little too loud, a little too forced. They were scared. They should be. The Mustangs roared to life in the gray dawn, their Rolls-Royce Merlin engines creating a symphony of power that could be felt in your chest. One by one, they lifted off into the uncertain European sky, forming up into combat formations, 4-ship flights, maintaining altitude and position, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the enemy they knew was coming. The rendezvous with the bomber stream went smoothly. The massive formation of B-17s appeared right on schedule, their contrails painting white lines across the cold blue sky. From a distance, they looked almost peaceful, majestic even. Up close, you could see the reality: aircraft patched from previous missions, replacement crews flying ships still bearing the bloodstains of men who hadn't made it back. Howard's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional. "Stay sharp, boys. Keep your intervals. Check your 6." The flight into German airspace was tense but uneventful for the first hour. Below, the patchwork of European countryside rolled past, serene and oblivious to the drama unfolding thousands of feet above. Then the radio chatter changed. Bomber crews were calling out enemy fighters. Lots of them. Howard spotted them first. Dark specks against the clouds, growing larger by the second. Bf 109s. Not just a few, but dozens of them, organizing into attack formations. This wasn't a probe or a harassing attack. This was an all-out assault designed to shred the bomber formation. "Bandits 11 o'clock high!" Howard's voice cut through the radio frequency. Multiple contacts. This is going to get messy. The Mustangs broke formation, diving to intercept the German fighters before they could reach the vulnerable bombers. This was what they'd trained for, what every escort mission ultimately came down to: keeping the enemy away from those big, slow targets packed with 10-man crews. But something was wrong. More enemy fighters kept appearing. The Germans had committed everything to this intercept. For every Bf-109 the Americans engaged, 2 more seemed to appear. Within minutes, Howard's carefully organized squadron was scattered across miles of sky, individual dogfights erupting everywhere. Howard found himself alone, separated from his wingmen in the chaos. Below him, a formation of 6 Bf-109s was setting up for a firing pass on a crippled B-17 that had fallen behind the main formation. The bomber's No. 3 engine was trailing smoke, and it was losing altitude. In minutes, it would be easy prey. The conventional tactic was clear. Dive from above, use superior altitude and speed to make a single pass, hope to scatter the enemy formation, then climb back to altitude and reset. It was doctrine. It was what every fighter pilot learned in training. But Jimmy Howard had learned something else in the skies over China, and in the 100 missions since. Sometimes doctrine wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to do something unexpected, something the enemy couldn't prepare for, something so audacious and apparently suicidal that it paralyzed the rational tactical mind of your opponent. He looked at those 6 Bf-109s, perfectly positioned for their attack run. He looked at the dying bomber, its crew helplessly waiting for the inevitable. And in that moment, Captain James Howard made a decision that would rewrite the textbooks on air combat. He pushed the Mustang's nose down and aimed directly at the center of the German formation. Not for a deflection shot, not for a diving pass. Head on. Straight at them. 6 against 1. Closing speed over 700 miles per hour. It was insane. It was suicide. It was exactly what needed to happen. The moment of madness. The closure rate was incomprehensible to the human mind. 2 formations of aircraft, combined speed exceeding 700 miles per hour. The distance between them evaporating at over 1,000 feet per second. In the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, Captain James Howard had perhaps 3 seconds to live. The lead German pilot in the Bf-109 formation saw the lone American fighter coming head-on and must have thought the pilot had lost his mind. In 3 years of air combat over Europe, the Luftwaffe had seen every tactic the Allies could devise. They'd faced timid pilots and aggressive ones, skilled aviators and nervous rookies. But nobody, absolutely nobody, charged head-on into a 6-ship formation alone. Fighter combat doctrine on both sides was built on immutable principles: energy management, altitude advantage, numerical superiority, deflection shooting. Head-on passes were considered desperation moves, usually resulting in both aircraft destroying each other. The closing speed was too high, the firing window too brief, and the danger of collision too great. A head-on attack against multiple opponents wasn't just discouraged in training, it was considered tantamount to suicide. But Howard had recognized something in that split second of decision, something about human psychology that transcended nationality and uniform. When faced with an opponent doing something completely irrational, completely unexpected, the human mind freezes. It searches for the logical explanation, the tactical reason, the trap. And in combat, that moment of hesitation is fatal. At 1,000 yards, Howard's 650 caliber machine guns opened fire. The Brownings roared, each gun firing 13 rounds per second, creating a cone of lead that filled the air between him and the German formation. Tracers arced across the sky like deadly meteors. The sound inside the cockpit was deafening, a continuous hammering that vibrated through the entire airframe. The German formation never broke, not because they were brave, but because they literally didn't have time to process what was happening. The human brain needs time to assess, decide, and act. Time measured in seconds. Time they didn't have. At 500 yards, Howard's stream of fire found its first target. The Bf-109 on the far left of the formation simply exploded. One moment it was there, a sleek killing machine painted in Luftwaffe gray-green. The next moment it was debris, fragments of metal and flame tumbling through the sky. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. The second Bf-109 disintegrated at 300 yards. Howard's fire walked across its engine, cowling and into the cockpit. The aircraft pitched violently upward, then snap-rolled into an inverted spin. 2 down. At 200 yards, the German pilots finally began to react. But it was far too late. Breaking formation now, at this closure rate, was as dangerous as staying in it. The lead pilot tried to dive, instinct overriding training. His wingman tried to pull up. They collided in a catastrophic mid-air explosion that consumed both aircraft instantly. 4 down, 100 yards. Howard's Mustang was now committed. Even if he'd wanted to break off, the speed and distance made it impossible. He was going to fly through whatever remained of that formation, or die trying. His finger stayed locked on the trigger, his guns pouring fire into the chaos ahead. The 5th Bf-109 took hits across its left wing. The wing folded upward at an impossible angle, torn away by the aerodynamic forces at near maximum speed. The aircraft tumbled sideways, a spinning coffin carrying its pilot to Earth. 5 down. The 6th pilot, the only one with enough situational awareness to truly react, pushed his stick forward hard, diving away from the incoming fire. But Howard's tracer stream followed him down. Rounds punched through the Bf-109's thin fuselage armor. The aircraft kept diving, steeper and steeper, until it was pointed nearly straight down. Whether the pilot was dead at the controls or had simply lost control in his panic to escape, the result was the same. The Bf-109 augured into the German countryside at terminal velocity. 6 down. Howard's Mustang burst through the space where the German formation had existed 14 seconds earlier. Debris bounced off his wings and fuselage. A piece of something metallic cracked his canopy but didn't penetrate. The smell of cordite from his guns filled the cockpit. His airspeed indicator showed over 400 miles per hour. His altitude had dropped 2,000 feet. His ammunition counters showed he'd fired nearly 800 rounds in that single pass. Behind him, 6 Bf-109s were falling from the sky in various states of destruction. Not a single one would make it back to base. Not a single German pilot would survive to report what had happened. The crippled B-17 Howard had been trying to save was still there, still flying, its crew undoubtedly staring in disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. 1 fighter, 1 pass, 6 enemy aircraft destroyed in the time it took to read a paragraph. Howard pulled back on the stick, trading his excess speed for altitude, his Mustang climbing back toward the bomber stream. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had carried him through the engagement finally catching up with his nervous system. His mouth was dry, his heart hammered in his chest. Jesus Christ, a voice crackled over the radio. One of the bomber gunners, breaking radio discipline in his shock. Did you guys see that? Did that actually just happen? Howard keyed his microphone. Mustang leader to bomber group. You're clear of bandits for now. Stay in formation and maintain course. His voice was steady, professional, giving no hint of the fact that he'd just done something that every instructor, every tactical manual, every experienced combat pilot would have told him was impossible. But the gun camera mounted behind his propeller had recorded every second. The evidence was there, captured on film, undeniable and unprecedented. More German fighters were appearing on the horizon. The battle wasn't over. But something fundamental had changed in those 14 seconds. Howard had discovered a tactic that, while suicidal in theory, worked in practice because of human psychology and the specific characteristics of the head-on engagement geometry. The Germans were aggressive, skilled, and experienced, but they'd never seen anything like this. And in the split second where human psychology fought with tactical training, where the rational mind struggled to comprehend the irrational action, that hesitation had been fatal. Howard rejoined what remained of his scattered squadron. More dogfights erupted around the bomber stream. But he kept thinking about those 14 seconds, about the way the German formation had frozen, about the devastating effectiveness of concentrated fire in a head-on pass, about how one moment of apparent madness had achieved what conventional tactics couldn't. He didn't know it yet, but the gun camera footage from his Mustang would be studied by every fighter tactics instructor in the Allied Air Forces. What he'd done would be analyzed, refined, and systematically incorporated into combat doctrine. The head-on pass would evolve from a desperation move to a calculated tactical option. But that was later. Right now, over the skies of Nazi Germany, Captain James Howard had just rewritten the rules of air combat, one impossible engagement at a time. The aftermath and investigation. The debriefing room at RAF Steeple Morden fell silent when Captain James Howard finished his combat report. 20 pairs of eyes stared at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright skepticism. Intelligence officers exchanged glances. Squadron commanders shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Nobody wanted to be the first to call a decorated combat veteran a liar, but the numbers simply didn't add up. Major Thomas, the intelligence officer, cleared his throat. "Captain Howard, let me make sure I understand correctly. You're claiming 6 confirmed kills in a single engagement, a head-on pass, alone, against a coordinated enemy formation." Howard's jaw tightened. "I'm not claiming anything, Major. I'm reporting what happened." "The bomber crews witnessed it. Check with them." "We will," Thomas replied, his tone carefully neutral. "But you have to understand our position. In the entire history of this air war, no single pilot has ever destroyed 6 enemy aircraft in one pass. The mathematics of ammunition expenditure alone makes it nearly impossible." The door opened and a junior officer entered carrying a metal film canister. "Sir, the gun camera footage from Captain Howard's aircraft. Just developed." Every person in the room leaned forward. Gun cameras didn't lie. Mounted behind the propeller hub, they automatically recorded whenever the trigger was pressed. Whatever was on that film would be the objective truth of what happened over Germany that morning. The projector clattered to life, throwing a grainy black and white image onto the briefing room wall. The footage was shaky, vibrating with the recoil of 6 machine guns firing simultaneously. But what it showed was unmistakable. Timestamp 0. 6 distinct aircraft silhouettes, Bf-109s in tight formation, growing larger in the frame with terrifying speed. Timestamp 3 seconds. Tracer fire filling the screen, the first aircraft exploding into fragments. Timestamp 7 seconds. 2 more aircraft colliding in a fireball. Timestamp 11 seconds. Another Bf-109 breaking apart, its wing separation clearly visible. Timestamp 14 seconds. The final aircraft spinning away, trailing smoke and flame. The film kept rolling, showing Howard's Mustang bursting through the debris field, pieces of destroyed aircraft visible as blurs passing the camera, then nothing but empty sky. The projector's bulb hummed in the sudden silence. Major Thomas removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Run it again." They watched the footage 3 more times. Each viewing confirmed what nobody wanted to believe. Somehow, impossibly, Howard had done exactly what he claimed. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 1 firing pass, 6 enemy fighters destroyed in 14 seconds of combat. How? The question came from Captain Reynolds, a veteran P-47 pilot with 20 missions under his belt. How is this even possible? The closing speed alone should have made accurate fire impossible. Howard stood and walked to the frozen frame showing the initial approach. "Look at their formation. They're stacked horizontally, not vertically. When I opened fire, my bullet stream didn't have to track individual targets. I created a wall of lead they had to fly through." "But they should have broken," Reynolds insisted. "Standard evasion tactics. The moment they saw you coming head on, they should have scattered." "They didn't have time," Howard explained. "The human brain needs a moment to process an unexpected threat. They were expecting a diving attack from above or a stern chase from behind, not a head-on charge. By the time their minds caught up with what was happening, it was too late." Colonel Mitchell, the group commander, spoke up for the first time. "You're describing a psychological phenomenon, not a tactical maneuver." "Yes, sir, exactly." Howard met his commanding officer's eyes. "Every fighter tactic we use assumes the enemy will react rationally, predictably. But what if we do something so irrational that it paralyzes their decision-making process, even for just a few seconds?" An older officer in the back of the room stood. Colonel Grant, former Royal Air Force, now serving as a tactical liaison. His voice carried the weight of decades of military aviation experience. "Gentlemen, what we're witnessing here is the evolution of aerial combat doctrine in real time. Captain Howard has stumbled onto something significant, whether he fully realizes it or not." Grant approached the projected image. "Consider the physics. In a head-on engagement, both aircraft are moving toward a mutual point in space. The angular change is minimal compared to deflection shooting. Yes, the closing speed is extreme, but the tracking requirements are actually simpler. Add to that the concentration of fire from multiple guns converging at a fixed point, and you create a lethal cone that's difficult to avoid. But the collision risk, someone objected, is precisely what makes this work psychologically, Grant continued. Every pilot's survival instinct screams at them to evade when they see an aircraft coming straight at them. That instinct creates the hesitation Captain Howard exploited. They're not just processing a tactical threat, they're fighting their own survival reflexes. The room erupted in discussion. Pilots argued about ammunition conservation, structural limits of pulling high G brakes at combat speed, the statistical probability of hitting multiple targets. But the film didn't lie. Whatever the theoretical objections, Howard had proven it could be done. Over the next 3 days, a special team analyzed every frame of the gun camera footage. They calculated angles, measured distances using reference points, estimated ammunition expenditure. They interviewed the B-17 crew Howard had saved, whose bombardier had watched the entire engagement through his nose turret. They pulled Howard's maintenance records to verify his guns were properly harmonized and bore-sighted. Every piece of evidence confirmed the same conclusion. On January 11, 1944, Captain James Howard had accomplished something unprecedented in aerial combat. But the investigation revealed something else, something that made the tactical analysts pause. Howard had been firing in short, controlled bursts rather than one continuous stream. Despite the engagement lasting only 14 seconds, his trigger discipline showed conscious fire control. He hadn't simply pulled the trigger and held it down in panic or desperation. Even in the chaos of a 700-mile-per-hour closure rate, he'd maintained enough control to manage his ammunition. "Why the burst fire?" Major Thomas asked during a follow-up interview. Most pilots in that situation would empty their guns in pure reflex. Howard considered the question. In China, flying P-40s with the Flying Tigers, ammunition conservation was everything. We couldn't replace expended rounds easily. You learned to make every bullet count. Even in the moment, even with all that happening, that training was there. The psychological evaluation was perhaps most interesting. The flight surgeon interviewed Howard extensively, trying to understand the mental state that allowed a pilot to make such a decision under extreme stress. Howard's response was remarkably simple. "I saw what needed to happen and I did it. There wasn't time to be afraid or overthink it." But neurological studies of combat pilots had shown that the brain under extreme stress doesn't operate logically. It relies on training, on muscle memory, on instinctive reactions programmed through repetition. Howard's decision to charge head-on into 6 enemy fighters wasn't logical. It was something else entirely. A combination of experience, instinct, and perhaps something that couldn't be quantified or taught. The warrior's intuition for the unexpected move that changes everything. The official report, classified at first, eventually made its way up the chain of command. Copies went to 8th Air Force Headquarters, to Fighter Tactics Development Units, to training commands on both sides of the Atlantic. The gun camera footage was studied frame by instructors who would reshape how fighter pilots thought about aerial engagement. Within weeks, whispers about Howard's head-on pass circulated through fighter squadrons across England. Pilots debated it in mess halls and ready rooms. Some called it genius, others called it insanity. But everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. The textbooks would need to be rewritten. The tactics manuals would need new chapters. And somewhere over Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were trying to understand what had happened to 6 of their fighters and whether it would happen again. The tactical revolution. By March 1944, every P-51 Mustang pilot in the European theater had watched Howard's gun camera footage at least twice. Some had seen it a dozen times. The grainy black and white film had become required viewing, studied with the intensity of medical students examining a revolutionary surgical technique. But watching was one thing. Implementing was entirely different. The first attempts to replicate Howard's success were disasters. 3 pilots died in the initial training exercises when head-on passes at combat speeds resulted in mid-air collisions. 2 more lost control during the violent evasive maneuvers required after completing the attack run. The fighter command brass nearly scrapped the entire concept, dismissing it as a fluke that couldn't be systematically taught. But Captain Mitchell Pierce, a former test pilot assigned to the Tactical Development Unit, saw something others missed. He spent weeks analyzing not just what Howard had done, but why it worked. His conclusions would transform aerial warfare. The problem, Pierce explained to a room full of skeptical squadron leaders, is that we're teaching this as a desperation tactic. It's not. It's a precision maneuver that requires specific conditions and exceptional fire discipline. He clicked through a series of diagrams showing attack angles, closure rates, and firing solutions. Look at the geometry. Howard didn't just point his nose at the enemy and pull the trigger. His approach angle was calculated to maximize his firing time while minimizing collision risk. He came in slightly below their formation plane, pulling up through their altitude as he fired. This gave him an extra second of firing time and a natural breakaway vector. The room remained silent, but Pierce saw understanding beginning to dawn on several faces. Furthermore, he continued, this only works against formations, not individual aircraft. Why? Because formation flying requires pilots to maintain position relative to each other. When threatened, their training tells them to stay in formation until the leader makes a break command. That moment of coordination requirement is the vulnerability window. Over the next 2 months, Pierce developed a systematic training program. Pilots learned to identify formations vulnerable to head-on attacks. They practiced firing discipline, using short bursts to walk fire across multiple targets rather than focusing on a single aircraft. They trained in pairs, with one pilot making the head-on pass while his wingman provided high cover, ready to engage any enemy fighters that survived the initial attack. The aircraft themselves were modified. Armorer crews adjusted gun harmonization patterns, converging the 650 caliber machine guns at 300 yards rather than the standard 400. This created a tighter, more lethal cone of fire at close range. Some aircraft received experimental gun cameras with faster film speeds, capturing better footage for post-mission analysis. But the most significant change was psychological. Instructors worked to overcome the natural human aversion to head-on approaches. They used Howard's footage extensively, breaking down exactly what happened in each second of the engagement. They emphasized that this wasn't about bravery or aggression. It was about calculated risk based on specific tactical circumstances. The breakthrough came in April 1944 during a large-scale raid on German aircraft factories. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, found himself in a situation eerily similar to Howard's original engagement. A formation of 5 FW-190s was positioning for an attack on a damaged B-24 bomber struggling to maintain altitude. Johnson had studied the footage. He understood the principles Pierce had identified. Instead of following conventional doctrine and diving from above, he positioned himself for a head-on approach. 2 miles out, he steadied his aircraft, checked his gun sight, and began his run. The results were captured on his gun camera. 4 FW-190s destroyed in 12 seconds. The 5th broke away successfully but was so disoriented by the attack that Johnson's wingman shot it down moments later. The bomber made it home safely. Word of Johnson's success spread rapidly through the fighter groups. Within weeks, similar engagements were being reported across the European theater. The statistics were remarkable. Head-on attacks against formations showed a kill ratio of 3-to-1, compared to the traditional 2-to-1 for conventional diving attacks. More importantly, they were achieving these results with lower friendly casualties. The Luftwaffe noticed. German after-action reports from spring 1944 show increasing references to aggressive American fighters making frontal attacks. The German response was predictable but slow. Formation tactics were modified to place more aircraft in front-facing defensive positions. Some units began training for rapid formation breaks when frontal threats appeared. But the Germans faced a problem. Their tactical doctrine was built on years of successful combat operations. Changing fundamental principles required overcoming institutional inertia. By the time new defensive measures were being implemented, American pilots had already incorporated counter-tactics. The evolution became a deadly dance. Americans refined their approach angles to exploit specific German formation weaknesses. Germans adjusted their formations. Americans adapted again. Each modification was bought with blood, measured in lost aircraft and dead pilots on both sides. By D-Day in June 1944, the head-on pass had evolved from Howard's spontaneous decision into a sophisticated tactical option taught to every fighter pilot in the Allied Air Forces. Training manuals included specific chapters on execution techniques, target selection criteria, and breakaway procedures. Gun camera footage from dozens of successful engagements provided case studies in what worked and what didn't. The impact extended beyond individual combat results. The psychological effect on German pilots was significant. Intelligence reports from interrogated Luftwaffe prisoners revealed that American fighters were now perceived as more aggressive, more unpredictable, and more dangerous than they had been just months earlier. Some experienced German pilots admitted that the constant threat of frontal attacks had fundamentally altered how they approached combat. Aircraft design began incorporating lessons from the tactic. Engineers adjusted gun placement on newer fighter models to optimize convergence for head-on engagements. Armor protection was enhanced around cockpit areas to provide better defense against frontal attacks. Even ammunition loadouts changed, with a higher proportion of armor-piercing rounds mixed with incendiaries to maximize damage during brief firing windows. The Royal Air Force, initially skeptical of what they considered reckless American aggression, began their own evaluation programs. British test pilots flew captured German aircraft against Spitfires and Typhoons using head-on tactics. Their conclusions mirrored the American findings. When executed properly, frontal attacks against formations were devastatingly effective. By August 1944, tactical manuals for all Allied fighter forces included detailed procedures for head-on engagement. What had begun as one pilot's split-second decision had become institutionalized doctrine, taught to thousands of pilots across multiple air forces and theater commands. The revolution was complete. Air combat would never be the same. And it all traced back to 14 seconds over Germany when Captain James Howard proved that sometimes the most dangerous tactic is the one nobody expects. Legacy and the man behind the maneuver. Captain James Howard received the Medal of Honor on August 1944, presented by General Jimmy Doolittle himself at a ceremony attended by over 2,000 personnel. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and intrepidity during the January 11th engagement. But Howard, characteristically modest, deflected attention from his individual actions to the broader mission of protecting bomber crews. "I did what needed doing," he told reporters after the ceremony. "Any pilot in my position would have made the same choice. History would prove him wrong on that count. Not every pilot would have made that choice. That's precisely what made it revolutionary." Howard continued flying combat missions through the end of the European War. His final tally reached over 6 confirmed kills, but the number barely captured his real contribution. Dozens of bomber crews made it home because of escort tactics his engagement had inspired. Hundreds of fighter pilots survived combat by applying principles derived from those 14 seconds over Germany. The war ended. Howard returned home, married, and largely disappeared from public life. He ran a crop-dusting business in Missouri, flying low and slow over cornfields, a far cry from the high-altitude dogfights of his military career. When aviation historians tracked him down decades later, they found a quiet man in his 70s, uncomfortable with the hero worship, more interested in talking about agricultural aviation than wartime exploits. "People make too much of that one engagement," he said in a 1982 interview. "War isn't about individual glory. It's about doing your job so the person next to you can do theirs." But the military understood what Howard himself seemed reluctant to acknowledge. His spontaneous decision had unlocked something fundamental about aerial combat psychology. The lessons didn't end with World War II. Korea brought jet combat, speeds that would have been unimaginable to World War II pilots. Yet American fighter pilots flying F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15s found themselves applying principles derived from Howard's engagement. The head-on pass, adapted for supersonic speeds, became a standard tactical option. Chinese and North Korean pilots trained in Soviet doctrine, emphasizing diving attacks and energy management, repeatedly fell victim to aggressive frontal assaults that violated their tactical expectations. Captain James Jabara, the first American jet ace, credited studying World War II gun camera footage, including Howard's engagement, with shaping his approach to combat. "You learn that the enemy's mind is your primary target," Jabara explained. "The aircraft is secondary. If you can get inside their decision cycle, make them react instead of act, you've already won." Vietnam presented different challenges. Surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided weapons changed the calculus of aerial combat. But the psychological principles Howard had exploited remained relevant. Navy pilots discovered that North Vietnamese MiG formations, while highly disciplined, showed predictable responses to unexpected threats. The head-on pass evolved again, this time incorporating radar lock-breaking maneuvers and electronic warfare considerations. The Air Force Weapons School at Nellis incorporated Howard's engagement into their curriculum not as a historical curiosity, but as a case study in tactical innovation. Student pilots analyzed the footage frame by frame, discussing not just what Howard did, but why it worked, and how similar principles might apply to modern combat scenarios. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, an F-15 pilot named Captain Richard Bennett found himself in a situation that eerily paralleled Howard's original engagement. 8 Iraqi aircraft were forming up to attack a coalition strike package. Bennett, low on missiles after earlier engagements, made a calculated decision to charge through the Iraqi formation using only his cannon. The results were captured on aircraft sensors and later declassified. 3 Iraqi aircraft destroyed in the initial pass, 4 more scattering in confusion, 1 remaining aircraft shot down by Bennett's wingman. The psychological impact of the aggressive frontal attack had created the same decision-making paralysis Howard had exploited 50 years earlier. Bennett later acknowledged his tactical choice was directly influenced by studying historical engagements during his training. "We don't just learn maneuvers," he explained. "We learn how humans think and react under extreme stress. That knowledge is timeless." Modern fighter doctrine now explicitly includes consideration of enemy psychology as a tactical factor. Computer simulations used in pilot training incorporate reaction time delays, decision-making hesitation, and formation integrity calculations derived from analysis of engagements like Howard's. The F-22 Raptor's flight control systems include programming optimized for head-on engagement profiles against multiple targets. James Howard passed away in 1995 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by 3 generations of fighter pilots, from World War II veterans to young aviators flying aircraft Howard could barely have imagined. The eulogy, delivered by a retired Air Force general, noted that Howard's legacy wasn't measured in medals or kill counts, but in the thousands of pilots who came home because someone had proven that unconventional thinking could overcome numerical disadvantage. The National Air and Space Museum preserves Howard's Medal of Honor and flight gear in their collection. But the real monument to his contribution exists in doctrine manuals, training curricula, and the tactical consciousness of every fighter pilot who understands that the greatest weapon isn't the aircraft or the missiles, it's the ability to do what the enemy believes impossible. Aviation historians debate whether Howard's engagement was brilliant improvisation or lucky intuition. Those who knew him suggest it was neither. It was the product of experience, situational awareness, and the warrior's willingness to accept risk in service of mission accomplishment. He saw what needed to happen and possessed both the skill and courage to execute it. In 2004, the Air Force unveiled a new fighter tactics manual. The opening chapter included a quote attributed to Howard, though he'd never spoken these exact words. "The enemy's greatest vulnerability isn't their aircraft or weapons. It's their assumptions about what you will or won't do." Whether he actually said this or it was synthesized from various interviews is unknown, but it captures the essence of what he proved on January 11, 1944. Today, every fighter pilot in the United States military knows the story. It's taught at the academy, at flight school, at advanced tactical training programs. The specifics change with each telling, but the core lesson remains constant. Warfare evolves through individuals willing to challenge established doctrine when circumstances demand innovation. Somewhere in storage facilities around the country, that original gun camera footage still exists, now digitized and preserved in multiple formats. 14 seconds of grainy black and white film that changed how humans think about aerial combat. 6 aircraft destroyed. One pilot who refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. James Howard never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He wanted to be remembered as a fighter pilot who did his job. History granted him both distinctions, whether he sought them or not. The legacy endures in every pilot who understands that the most dangerous thing you can do in combat is exactly what the enemy expects. And sometimes the most brilliant tactic looks exactly like insanity until the moment it succeeds. That's the lesson of January 11th, 1944. That's the legacy of Captain James Howard. And that's why, decades after his death, his name is still spoken with respect in every fighter squadron in the world.